At the end of the Qin dynasty, the empire that had once unified the warring states of China was already hollowed out from within. Qin Shi Huang had achieved what no ruler before him had managed to do, forcing the entire realm under a single authority through relentless military campaigns, standardized laws, and absolute control. Yet the same system that created unity also planted the seeds of collapse. The legalist policies that governed the state were harsh and unforgiving, relying on fear, collective punishment, and strict surveillance rather than consent or loyalty. Peasants were burdened with endless taxes and conscripted into massive labor projects such as the Great Wall, imperial roads, canals, and the vast mausoleum guarded by the terracotta army. For ordinary people, daily life became a cycle of exhaustion and punishment, and resentment quietly spread across villages and provinces. When Qin Shi Huang died in the year 210 before the Common Era, the empire lost the only figure capable of holding such a rigid system together. His death was concealed by court officials during the long journey back to the capital, a detail that symbolized the secrecy and paranoia at the heart of Qin politics. Power soon fell into the hands of Zhao Gao, a eunuch with immense influence, and Li Si, the chancellor who had helped design the legalist system. Through intrigue and forged edicts, they manipulated the succession, forcing the rightful heir to commit suicide and placing the pliable Qin heir Shi on the throne. This moment marked the true beginning of the end, because the new emperor lacked both authority and competence, while those around him governed through terror and personal ambition. Qin heir Shi proved incapable of ruling an empire already strained to its limits. Instead of easing burdens or restoring confidence, he intensified repression, increasing taxes and labor demands while executing officials who dared to speak honestly. Fear replaced governance, and loyalty evaporated. Reports of unrest multiplied, yet the court responded not with reform, but with denial and brutality. As punishments grew harsher, even minor offenses could result in death or forced labor, pushing many ordinary people into desperation. In this climate, rebellion was no longer unthinkable. It became inevitable. The spark that ignited widespread resistance came not from grand ideology but from survival. In the year 209 before the Common Era, a group of conscripted soldiers led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang faced execution after being delayed by storms while marching to their assigned post. Under Qin law, failure to arrive on time meant death, regardless of circumstance. Confronted with certain execution, they chose rebellion instead. Their uprising was small and poorly organized, yet its significance was enormous, because it shattered the illusion of Qin invincibility. Across the empire, peasants, former soldiers, and local strongmen rose in arms, driven by hunger, fear, and rage accumulated over decades. The Qin government attempted to suppress these revolts through force alone, but its armies were stretched thin, and its legitimacy was already broken. Generals were recalled, then executed for perceived failures, further weakening command structures. Provinces descended into chaos as rebel leaders declared themselves kings or generals, often invoking the memory of the old feudal states that Qin had destroyed. What had once been a centralized empire rapidly fragmented into competing factions, each claiming to act in the name of justice or restoration. Within the collapsing order, new figures emerged who would shape the next chapter of history. Among them were Xiang Yu, a noble descendant of the former state of Chu with unmatched military strength, and Liu Bang, a former minor official known for his pragmatism and ability to win popular support. At this stage, neither man yet dominated the landscape, but the vacuum left by Qin authority allowed individuals of very different backgrounds to rise. Their emergence illustrated how completely the old system had failed, because power was no longer tied to imperial appointment but to charisma, military success, and local allegiance. As rebellion spread, Zhao Gao attempted to maintain control through purges and intimidation, even orchestrating the execution of loyal generals and ministers. His actions culminated in the forced suicide of Qin heir Shi, a grim admission that the regime could no longer govern even itself. A new ruler was briefly installed, but the gesture was meaningless. By the year 206 before the Common Era, the Qin dynasty collapsed entirely when rebel forces entered the capital, ending the first imperial dynasty after little more than a decade of rule. The fall of Qin did not bring immediate peace or unity. Instead, it opened a violent and uncertain interlude in which former rebels, generals, and regional leaders competed for supremacy. Yet the memory of Qin's failure left a lasting imprint on the political consciousness of the age. Its collapse demonstrated that an empire built solely on coercion could not endure, and that stability required more than fear and punishment. The conditions created by Qin rule, its labor demands, legal brutality, and disregard for human suffering, directly shaped the conflicts that followed. From the ruins of this failed experiment in absolute control, the struggle that would eventually give birth to the Han Dynasty was about to begin. After the collapse of Qin authority, the land that had so recently been unified fell into a state of violent uncertainty. The destruction of the Qin dynasty did not produce a clear successor, nor did it restore the old feudal order in any stable form. Instead, dozens of rebel armies, former Qin generals, local elites, and self-proclaimed kings competed for territory, legitimacy, and survival. What followed was not a single war but a tangled series of conflicts that historians later summarized as the Chu-Han contention, a struggle that would decide the future shape of imperial rule in China. In the immediate aftermath of Qin's fall, Xiang Yu emerged as the most powerful military figure. Descended from a noble family of the former state of Chu, he possessed extraordinary physical strength, battlefield charisma, and an uncompromising sense of honor rooted in aristocratic values. Xiang Yu quickly defeated the main Qin forces and entered the heartland with overwhelming authority. His reputation alone caused rivals to surrender without fighting, and for a brief moment he appeared unstoppable. Yet his strength concealed a critical weakness. He distrusted centralized rule and believed that the empire should be divided among regional kings, much like the old feudal system that Qin had abolished. Liu Bang stood in stark contrast. Born into a peasant family and once employed as a low-ranking local official, he lacked noble lineage and legendary battlefield prowess. What he possessed instead was political instinct. Liu Bang understood the exhaustion of the population after years of forced labor and war, and he consciously presented himself as a ruler who would reduce burdens rather than impose new ones. When his forces entered the Qin capital ahead of Xiang Yu, Liu Bang issued strict orders forbidding looting and violence, a gesture that earned him immediate support from local residents and officials alike. This act, small in appearance, had enormous symbolic weight because it suggested a new way of governing after Qin. Despite Liu Bang's early success, Xiang Yu remained the dominant force. After defeating rival armies, he convened a grand settlement and divided the former Qin territory into 18 kingdoms, appointing himself hegemon king of Western Chu. Liu Bang was sent to rule the remote region of Hanzhong, a move intended to marginalize him politically and geographically. To Xiang Yu, this division seemed a restoration of order, but in reality, it guaranteed renewed conflict. The kings he appointed resented their unequal territories, feared Xiang Yu's power, and doubted the permanence of the arrangement. Instead of peace, the settlement created a fragile balance destined to collapse. Liu Bang used his exile strategically. In Hanzhong, he reorganized his forces, secured supply lines, and recruited capable advisors who would later prove decisive. Figures such as Han Xin, a brilliant but initially overlooked military strategist, found opportunity under Liu Bang's command. Han Xin's understanding of maneuver warfare, logistics, and psychological pressure transformed Liu Bang's army from a regional force into a disciplined instrument capable of challenging Xiang Yu directly. Unlike Xiang Yu, who relied on personal valor and fearsome reputation, Liu Bang increasingly relied on planning, delegation, and the systematic expansion of influence. As war resumed, the contrast between the two leaders became sharper. Xiang Yu continued to win spectacular victories, often annihilating enemy forces with brutal efficiency. His destruction of surrendered troops reinforced his image as an unmatched warrior, but it also alienated allies and terrified populations who might otherwise have supported him. Liu Bang, by comparison, lost several early battles but consistently recovered by preserving his forces and absorbing defectors. Each setback taught him how to adapt, while each victory by Xiang Yu deepened the latter's isolation. The conflict gradually evolved into a test of endurance rather than strength alone. Han Xin led a series of campaigns that dismantled Xiang Yu's support network, defeating rival kings and cutting off supply routes. These victories were not merely military but political, because each conquered territory brought new recruits and resources to Liu Bang's side. The war spread across the former Qin lands, devastating agriculture and displacing countless civilians. Yet the populations increasingly associated Liu Bang with stability and Xiang Yu with destruction. By the final phase of the struggle, Xiang Yu found himself surrounded and outnumbered. At Gaixia, Liu Bang's forces employed psychological warfare, ordering soldiers to sing songs from Chu, creating the illusion that Xiang Yu's homeland had already fallen. This moment broke the morale of Xiang Yu's troops and symbolized the collapse of his cause. In the year 202 before the Common Era, Xiang Yu chose suicide rather than capture, ending the Chu-Han contention and clearing the path for Liu Bang's victory. Liu Bang's triumph was not merely the defeat of a rival, but the resolution of a deeper question left unanswered by Qin's fall. The wars demonstrated that an empire could not survive on coercion alone, nor could it be sustained through fragmented feudal rule. What emerged from the chaos was a new political understanding shaped by both Qin's failures and the brutal lessons of civil war. With the battlefield finally silent, Liu Bang stood as the sole ruler, prepared to transform his hard-won authority into a lasting dynasty that would come to be known as Han. With the end of the Chu-Han contention, Liu Bang stood alone as the undisputed ruler of the realm. In the year 202 before the Common Era, he formally established the Han Dynasty and took the imperial title, becoming Emperor Gaozu of Han. The victory that brought him to power, however, left behind a land exhausted by decades of warfare, rebellion, and forced labor. Cities lay damaged, fields were abandoned, and the population had been sharply reduced. The first task of the new dynasty was therefore not expansion or glory, but survival and recovery. Liu Bang understood that if the mistakes of Qin were repeated, his rule would collapse just as quickly. One of the earliest decisions of Emperor Gaozu was to dismantle the harsh legalist framework that had defined Qin governance. While laws remained strict enough to maintain order, punishments were softened, and collective responsibility was reduced. Taxes and labor obligations were lowered, allowing peasants to return to their fields and rebuild their livelihoods. The emperor also ordered the release of many who had been enslaved or imprisoned under Qin policies, signaling a clear break with the previous regime. These measures were not acts of idealism alone, but calculated steps to restore productivity and trust between the state and the population. At the same time, the Han court faced a delicate political challenge. Many of the men who had helped Liu Bang win the empire were powerful generals and regional leaders with their own armies and ambitions. To reward loyalty and prevent immediate rebellion, the early Han adopted a hybrid system that combined centralized imperial authority with semi-autonomous kingdoms ruled by relatives and trusted allies. Members of the imperial Liu family were granted large territories as kings, while former comrades in arms were given noble titles and lands. This arrangement provided short-term stability, but also planted the seeds of future tension between the central government and regional powers. Within the court, Liu Bang relied heavily on capable advisors who had proven themselves during the war. Figures such as Shao He, who managed administration and logistics, and Cao Shen, who ensured continuity of governance, helped establish a functioning state apparatus. Han Xin, despite his decisive military contributions, eventually fell victim to suspicion and political intrigue, a reminder that the new dynasty still operated in a climate shaped by fear of betrayal. These internal struggles reflected a broader reality. The Han state was being built by people who had lived through chaos, and mutual trust was fragile. Economically, The early Han focused on agricultural recovery as the foundation of imperial strength. Land cultivation was encouraged, grain reserves were restored, and the state limited interference in local markets. Merchants were regulated but not crushed, and trade routes slowly reopened. The government recognized that prosperity at the village level translated directly into tax revenue and stability at the imperial level. This pragmatic approach contrasted sharply with Qin's obsession with control and uniformity, reinforcing the idea that flexibility was essential to long-term rule. Ideologically, the Han Dynasty began to distance itself from pure legalism without abandoning state authority. Confucian ideas, emphasizing moral governance, hierarchy, and benevolence, gradually regained influence, particularly in education and court ritual. Although Confucianism did not yet dominate state policy, its language and values helped legitimize imperial rule in the eyes of officials and scholars. The emperor was increasingly portrayed not merely as a law enforcer, but as a moral guardian responsible for the well-being of the people. This shift would later define the identity of the Han state. Despite these efforts, the early Han period was not free of instability. Several regional kings rebelled against imperial authority, testing the limits of the hybrid system. These uprisings were suppressed, but each conflict reinforced the lesson that decentralization carried serious risks. Over time, the central government began to reclaim power by reducing the autonomy of the kingdoms and placing greater authority in the hands of imperial officials. This gradual process aimed to strengthen unity without provoking widespread resistance, a balancing act shaped by the memory of Qin's collapse. Emperor Gaozu himself did not rule for long. His death in the year 195 before the Common Era brought new challenges as succession disputes and court politics threatened the fragile order. Yet the institutional foundations he established proved resilient enough to endure. Subsequent rulers continued the policies of moderation, economic recovery, and cautious centralization, allowing the dynasty to stabilize and expand. What had begun as a coalition of rebels and warlords was slowly transformed into a coherent imperial system. The early decades of the Han Dynasty demonstrated that rebuilding after collapse required compromise, patience, and adaptation. By easing burdens on the population, rewarding service while restraining ambition, and blending different political traditions, the Han created a model of governance capable of lasting far longer than Qin. This period of consolidation did not resolve all contradictions within the state, but it provided the stability necessary for future growth. From the ruins of civil war, the Han Empire had taken its first steps toward becoming one of the longest-enduring dynasties in Chinese history. As the Han Dynasty moved beyond its fragile beginnings, a long period of consolidation gradually evolved into what later historians would describe as the height of Western Han power. The empire benefited from decades of relative peace, population recovery, and expanding agricultural production. Imperial authority grew stronger as the central government refined its control over taxation, law, and military command. Yet beneath this surface of stability, new tensions emerged, not from open rebellion or external invasion, but from within the palace itself. Power increasingly shifted away from the emperor as an individual and into the hands of those who surrounded the throne. During this phase, the Han court became a complex political environment shaped by family ties, ritual authority, and personal influence. Emperors often ascended the throne at a young age, making them dependent on regents, senior ministers, and especially members of the empress's family. These relatives, known as external kin, gained access to offices, resources, and military commands through their connection to the imperial household. Over time, their authority rivaled that of long-serving officials, altering the balance of power within the state. This transformation did not occur suddenly. At first, the involvement of empress dowagers and their families appeared to provide continuity during successions. However, as generations passed, these networks became entrenched. Appointments were increasingly determined by blood ties rather than merit, weakening the administrative efficiency that had supported early Han recovery. Court politics turned inward, focusing on rivalries between families rather than governance of the empire. The emperor remained the symbolic center of authority, but real power often lay elsewhere. At the same time, the Western Han continued to expand its cultural and political influence. Confucianism gained official recognition as a guiding philosophy of governance, shaping education, court rituals, and the moral expectations placed upon officials. Schools were established to train administrators in classical learning, and moral language became central to political discourse. This ideological shift strengthened imperial legitimacy, but it also created a gap between idealized virtue and actual political practice. While officials spoke of benevolence and harmony, corruption and favoritism spread quietly through the bureaucracy. Life at court increasingly reflected this contradiction. Lavish ceremonies, elaborate palaces, and a growing imperial household placed heavy financial demands on the state. Although taxes remained moderate compared to Qin times, the cumulative burden of maintaining the court began to grow. Resources that could have strengthened local administration or infrastructure were redirected towards sustaining elite lifestyles. The empire was not yet in crisis, but inefficiencies were multiplying beneath the appearance of prosperity. Within this environment, personal stories from the court revealed the human cost of political imbalance. One of the most enduring figures of this era was Wang Zhaojun, a palace woman whose fate became symbolic of imperial priorities. Chosen to be sent beyond the frontier as part of a diplomatic marriage alliance, she was selected not through imperial judgment but through corruption among court painters who controlled access to the emperor. Her story later became a cultural emblem of sacrifice and injustice, illustrating how even imperial decisions were distorted by internal decay. Though romanticized in later generations, the episode reflected real flaws in court administration. As emperors relied increasingly on palace institutions, the influence of eunuchs also expanded. Originally intended as servants without family ties, eunuchs gradually became intermediaries between the emperor and the outer court. Their control over access to the throne gave them political leverage, particularly when emperors were young or withdrawn. While their power remained limited during most of the Western Han, the foundations of future dominance were already being laid. Despite these growing problems, the Western Han did not collapse immediately because its economic base remained strong. Population growth resumed, agricultural output increased, and trade networks extended across the empire. These material conditions masked political weaknesses, allowing the state to absorb inefficiency without visible breakdown. Stability was preserved not because the system was flawless, but because the resources of the empire were still sufficient to sustain it. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. As the Western Han approached its later generations, the accumulation of internal distortions became harder to ignore. Authority was diffused, accountability weakened, and court politics overshadowed provincial governance. The emperor's role increasingly resembled that of a figurehead, while real decisions were shaped by competing factions. This environment created ideal conditions for an ambitious and disciplined individual to rise by presenting himself as a reformer and restorer of order. By the end of this phase, the Western Han stood at a crossroads. Outwardly powerful and culturally confident, it was inwardly vulnerable to manipulation. The combination of moral rhetoric, entrenched family influence, and bureaucratic complacency left the system open to a dramatic shift in power. The stage was quietly being set for the rise of the Wang family, whose most famous member would soon challenge the very legitimacy of the Han throne. As the Western Han moved deeper into its later decades, political gravity increasingly shifted toward one powerful lineage, the Wang family. This transformation did not occur through open rebellion or sudden seizure of power, but through patient accumulation of influence within the existing imperial framework. The Wangs rose because they mastered the court system as it had evolved, exploiting its reliance on kinship, ritual authority, and appearances of moral legitimacy. Their ascent illustrated how the weaknesses of Western Han governance could be turned into a pathway toward control. The turning point came through marriage. When members of the Wang family became related to the imperial household through empresses and empress dowagers, they gained privileged access to the center of power. These familial ties allowed them to dominate key court positions, control appointments, and influence imperial decisions without formally holding the throne. Over time, emperors became increasingly dependent on Wang relatives for political stability, particularly during successions involving young or inexperienced rulers. What had once been a support structure gradually became a mechanism of dominance. Among the Wang clan, one figure stood apart for his calculated restraint and careful cultivation of reputation. Wang Mang presented himself as a model Confucian official, modest in lifestyle, respectful toward elders, and publicly devoted to moral principles. He rejected displays of luxury, observed ritual propriety, and distributed wealth to the poor, all while carefully documenting his virtue through court records and public acts. In a political culture that increasingly valued moral symbolism, this image was powerful. To many officials and scholars, Wang Mang appeared as the antidote to corruption rather than its beneficiary. As emperors passed away and regencies followed one another, Wang Mang's influence deepened. He secured positions that allowed him to oversee state rituals, legal reforms, and personnel decisions, embedding himself within every major function of government. His rivals were removed through accusations of immorality or incompetence, often framed in Confucian language that emphasized righteousness over ambition. Unlike earlier power holders who relied on fear, Wang Mang relied on consensus and moral authority, making his rise appear both natural and justified. During this period, the authority of the emperor continued to erode. Imperial decisions increasingly required approval or interpretation from Wang Mang and his allies. The court became accustomed to his leadership, and the distinction between regent and ruler blurred. Yet outwardly, the Han Dynasty remained intact. Coins bore the imperial name, rituals followed tradition, and proclamations were issued in the emperor's voice. This preservation of form masked the profound shift occurring beneath the surface. The broader social environment further strengthened Wang Mang's position. Economic inequality widened as large estates expanded at the expense of small farmers. Land concentration reduced tax revenues and increased peasant dependency, while local officials struggled to enforce regulations against powerful families. Natural disasters, including floods and droughts, were interpreted as signs of cosmic imbalance, reinforcing the belief that the ruling house had lost heaven's favor. In such a climate, calls for moral renewal carried extraordinary weight. Wang Mang skillfully aligned himself with these expectations. He spoke openly about restoring ancient institutions, reviving the ideals of earlier sage kings, and correcting the excesses of Western Han rule. His rhetoric suggested continuity rather than rupture, reform rather than revolution. Many scholars supported him, believing that a return to classical models would stabilize society and curb elite abuses. In their eyes, Wang Mang was not an usurper but a guardian of tradition. The final step in this transformation came when the emperor died without a strong successor. Wang Mang assumed the role of acting regent, a position that granted him effective control over the state. From this vantage point, he governed openly, issuing edicts, directing policy, and commanding loyalty from officials across the empire. Resistance was limited, not because opposition was impossible, but because his authority had been normalized over years of gradual expansion. By the end of this phase, the Western Han existed largely in name alone. Its institutions functioned, but their purpose had shifted toward sustaining Wang Mang's leadership. The dynasty had not yet fallen, but its sovereignty was already compromised. What remained was a final transformation, one that would replace the Han name with a new order claiming to restore moral balance. The conditions that enabled this change were not sudden disasters, but the cumulative result of decades of internal drift. With legitimacy hollowed out from within, the path was clear for Wang Mang to formally end the Western Han and proclaim a new dynasty. In the year 9 of the Common Era, Wang Mang took the final step that transformed his long regency into open rule. He formally declared the end of the Western Han and proclaimed a new dynasty which he named Xin, meaning new. The act was framed not as usurpation but as restoration. Wang Mang claimed that the Han house had lost the mandate of heaven and that cosmic signs, floods, eclipses, and social disorder proved the need for moral renewal. By presenting his accession as a return to ancient virtue rather than a seizure of power, he sought to legitimize his rule in the language that scholars and officials had come to respect. Once enthroned, Wang Mang moved quickly to implement an ambitious program of reforms unlike anything seen since the fall of Qin. Drawing heavily on classical texts, he attempted to recreate institutions that he believed had existed in a golden age of antiquity. Central to this vision was the transformation of land ownership. Wang Mang announced the abolition of private landholding, declaring all land to be owned by the state under a system often described as the king's fields. Families were to receive allotments based on size, and the buying and selling of land was prohibited. In theory, this policy aimed to reverse inequality and protect small farmers from powerful landlords. Alongside land reform, Wang Mang introduced sweeping changes to the institution of slavery. The buying and selling of enslaved people was restricted, and new terminology was imposed to reduce their legal degradation. These measures were presented as humanitarian corrections to long-standing abuses. However, they directly challenged entrenched interests among aristocratic families who relied on slave labor to maintain large estates. Enforcement proved inconsistent, and local officials often ignored or quietly undermined the new laws to avoid conflict with powerful elites. The monetary system also became a target of reform. Wang Mang believed that economic instability stemmed from corruption and deviation from ancient standards. Over the course of his reign, he introduced multiple new currencies, including bronze, gold, silver, and even symbolic objects such as knife-shaped and spade-shaped coins modeled on antiquity. These frequent changes confused merchants and peasants alike, disrupting trade and encouraging hoarding. Instead of stabilizing the economy, the reforms fractured trust in currency and slowed commercial activity across the empire. Administrative restructuring further strained the state. Offices were renamed, ranks redefined, and procedures rewritten to match classical ideals rather than practical realities. Officials trained under the Han system struggled to adapt, while those loyal to Wang Mang often lacked experience. The bureaucracy became clogged with conflicting regulations, making governance slow and unpredictable. While Wang Mang believed that moral correctness would compensate for inefficiency, everyday administration suffered as a result. At the same time, nature dealt a devastating blow. Beginning in the early years of the Qin dynasty, the Yellow River changed its course following massive floods, inundating farmland and displacing countless communities. Crops failed, famine spread, and refugees wandered in search of food and security. These disasters were interpreted by many as evidence that Wang Mang himself had lost the mandate of heaven. The very signs he had once used to justify his rise now turned against him in the popular imagination. The government's response to crisis exposed the limits of idealistic reform. Relief efforts were poorly coordinated, and grain reserves proved insufficient. Officials struggled to implement land redistribution while people were starving and homeless. Tax collection faltered, and military supply lines weakened. In this environment, resentment grew rapidly among peasants who had initially hoped that Wang Mang's reforms would ease their suffering. Opposition did not yet take the form of organized rebellion, but the foundations were being laid. Bandit groups expanded as starving villagers turned to survival by force. Local leaders began to mobilize followers, often invoking the suffering caused by Qin policies. Wang Mang responded with decrees and moral exhortations rather than structural adjustment, insisting that stricter adherence to reform would eventually restore harmony. By the middle of his reign, the contradiction at the heart of the Qin dynasty was unmistakable. Wang Mang sought to govern an empire shattered by war, inequality, and disaster using models drawn from an imagined past. His intentions may have been framed as virtuous, but his methods failed to account for the complexity of a society transformed by centuries of imperial rule. Instead of renewal, his reforms accelerated instability. The state weakened, loyalty eroded, and the distance between the court and the countryside widened. The conditions were now set for open rebellion, as suffering populations searched for leaders who could offer immediate relief rather than moral promises. As hardship spread across the empire, the discontent that had been building under the Han Dynasty finally erupted into open rebellion. What began as scattered banditry and local unrest gradually transformed into organized resistance driven by hunger, displacement, and a growing belief that Wang Mang's rule had violated the natural order. Peasants who had once welcomed promises of reform now saw those promises collapse under the weight of famine and bureaucratic paralysis. In this atmosphere, rebellion became not an act of ambition, but a means of survival. Among the earliest and most significant movements were the forces later known as the Lulin, or Green Forest Rebels. Operating in the mountainous regions, these groups were composed largely of displaced farmers and former soldiers who had lost land and livelihood due to floods and failed reforms. Their strength lay not in discipline or equipment, but in numbers and shared desperation. They attacked local officials, seized grain stores, and disrupted tax collection, gradually expanding their influence across multiple commanderies. The Qin government labeled them criminals, yet to many villagers they appeared as avengers against an unresponsive state. At the same time, other rebel factions emerged independently, reflecting the fragmented nature of resistance. These groups often lacked coordination, but they were united by hostility toward the Qin regime. Wang Mang attempted to suppress them through military force, yet his armies were weakened by poor logistics, low morale, and unreliable leadership. Soldiers recruited from starving populations lacked loyalty, while commanders hesitated to engage decisively, aware that defeat could bring execution. Each failed campaign further eroded the authority of the central government. The situation worsened when members of the former imperial Liu family entered the conflict. Claiming descent from the Han line, they presented themselves as legitimate alternatives to Wang Mang's rule. This claim resonated deeply because many officials and common people still associated the Han name with stability and order. Among these figures was Liu Xiu, a distant relative of the Han imperial house, whose rise would prove decisive. Unlike many rebel leaders, Liu Xiu combined restraint, strategic awareness, and an ability to attract capable followers. The turning point came with the confrontation at Kunyang. Wang Mang dispatched a massive force, recorded in historical accounts as numbering more than 430,000 troops, to crush the Han Restoration movement. Facing them was a much smaller army led by Liu Xiu and his allies. Against all expectations, the smaller force chose not to retreat. Instead, they exploited divisions within the Qin army, launched surprise attacks, and relied on superior morale. Panic spread among Wang Mang's troops, turning numerical advantage into chaos. As the Qin army collapsed, soldiers fled in disarray, many drowning while attempting to cross rivers during their retreat. The defeat at Kunyang shattered the illusion of Qin invincibility. News of the loss spread rapidly, inspiring new uprisings and defections. Officials abandoned their posts, cities opened their gates to rebel forces, and entire regions slipped beyond central control. Wang Mang attempted to rally support through proclamations and renewed reforms, but his words carried little weight. The mandate of heaven, once claimed as the foundation of his rule, now seemed decisively withdrawn. As rebel forces advanced toward the capital, Wang Mang found himself increasingly isolated. Advisors deserted him, and palace guards questioned their loyalty. In the year 23 of the Common Era, insurgents entered Chang'an. Wang Mang was killed during the fighting, bringing the Han Dynasty to an abrupt and violent end. His death did not immediately restore order, but it removed the focal point of opposition and marked the collapse of his reformist experiment. The fall of Wang Mang closed a turbulent chapter marked by idealism, disaster, and resistance. His attempt to reshape society through moral and institutional reform failed because it ignored the immediate realities of hunger, displacement, and administrative capacity. Yet the rebellion that overthrew him did more than destroy a regime. It reopened the question of legitimate rule and revived the possibility of Han restoration. Amid the ruins of Qin authority, Liu Xiu emerged not merely as a victorious rebel, but as a unifying figure capable of rebuilding imperial order. The empire stood once again at the threshold between chaos and consolidation. After the violent collapse of the Qin dynasty, the empire entered another uncertain interval marked by competing forces, devastated regions, and a population weary of continuous upheaval. Although Wang Mang was dead, the question of legitimate authority remained unresolved. Numerous rebel leaders and regional powers attempted to claim control, but none possessed the combination of lineage, restraint, and administrative vision necessary to reunify the realm. In this unstable landscape, Liu Xiu gradually distinguished himself not through dramatic proclamations, but through measured action and careful consolidation. Liu Xiu's claim rested on his descent from the Han imperial family, a connection that carried deep symbolic power. For decades, the Han name had represented relative stability, reduced burdens, and a familiar political order. By invoking this legacy, Liu Xiu positioned himself not as a revolutionary, but as a restorer. His message resonated with officials who had survived multiple regime changes and with local elites seeking predictability rather than ideological transformation. Rather than dismantling existing structures, he focused on repairing them. Military success played a crucial role in this process, but Liu Xiu avoided the excesses that had alienated populations in earlier conflicts. He emphasized discipline, discouraged indiscriminate violence, and incorporated surrendered enemies into his forces whenever possible. This approach reduced resistance and expanded his base of support. Over time, rival claimants were defeated or absorbed, not solely through force, but through negotiation and strategic patience. Victory was achieved incrementally, allowing war-torn regions to recover instead of being further devastated. In the year 25 of the Common Era, Liu Xiu formally proclaimed himself emperor, adopting the reign name Guangwu and establishing what would later be known as the Eastern Han Dynasty. He chose Luoyang as the new capital, a decision reflecting both practical and symbolic considerations. Luoyang's location offered better control over the eastern heartland and reduced the logistical challenges that had plagued Chang'an during times of crisis. The relocation also marked a clear break from the recent past, signaling renewal without erasing tradition. Emperor Guangwu faced an immense task. Years of warfare had shattered infrastructure, depopulated entire regions, and disrupted administrative continuity. His first priority was stabilization. Taxes were reduced, forced labor was limited, and efforts were made to resettle displaced populations. Former officials who demonstrated competence and loyalty were reinstated regardless of their service under previous regimes, reinforcing the idea that governance mattered more than factional allegiance. This inclusiveness helped rebuild the bureaucratic core of the state. Central authority was gradually restored, but Guangwu remained cautious about over-centralization. The memory of Qin's collapse and Wang Mang's failures shaped his policies. Regional officials were granted sufficient autonomy to respond to local conditions, yet their powers were clearly defined and monitored. Military commanders were rotated to prevent the formation of independent power bases, and land grants were carefully regulated. These measures reflected lessons learned from earlier periods, balancing flexibility with control. Economically, the Eastern Han inherited a weakened but recoverable system. Agriculture once again formed the foundation of recovery. The state encouraged cultivation, repaired irrigation works, and restored granaries to buffer against famine. Trade slowly revived as roads and markets reopened, allowing goods to circulate between regions. Although inequality remained, the immediate crisis of survival eased, enabling communities to rebuild social and economic networks disrupted by decades of instability. Ideologically, Confucianism became more firmly entrenched as the guiding framework of the state. Emperor Guangwu promoted moral governance, filial piety, and loyalty as principles that linked ruler and subject. Education and scholarship were encouraged, reinforcing a shared cultural identity across the empire. Unlike Wang Mang's rigid application of classical models, the Eastern Han employed Confucian ideals pragmatically, using them to legitimize authority rather than dictate inflexible policy. Despite these successes, the restored dynasty carried within it unresolved vulnerabilities. The imperial family expanded, and future successions would again involve young emperors reliant on regents. The court's dependence on inner palace institutions slowly increased, laying the groundwork for the rise of eunuch influence. These developments were not immediately destabilizing, but they represented structural tendencies that would re-emerge over time. For the moment, however, the Eastern Han achieved what had seemed impossible only years earlier: the restoration of imperial order. The transition from chaos to stability did not erase the scars of rebellion and famine, but it provided a framework within which recovery could occur. Emperor Guangwu's reign demonstrated that legitimacy grounded in restraint, inclusion, and gradual reform could succeed where coercion and radical transformation had failed. The Han Dynasty, once thought extinguished, now entered a new phase of existence, carrying forward both the achievements and contradictions of its long history. As the Eastern Han Dynasty progressed beyond its early recovery, the stability achieved under Emperor Guangwu gradually gave way to familiar patterns of internal decay. The empire remained intact, its borders largely secure and its institutions functioning, yet the forces that undermined Western Han rule slowly resurfaced. These pressures did not appear as sudden crises, but as accumulative distortions that weakened governance over generations. By the middle and later decades of Eastern Han, political authority once again drifted away from effective imperial control. A central factor in this decline was the repeated accession of child emperors. When young rulers ascended the throne, real power fell to regents, most often empress dowagers and their relatives. External kin gained control over appointments, military commands, and fiscal decisions, using their proximity to the throne to dominate the court. This pattern created cycles of factional struggle in which rival families competed for influence, often purging one another through accusations of treason or moral failure. While these conflicts unfolded within the palace, provincial administration suffered from neglect and inconsistency. At the same time, eunuchs expanded their influence far beyond their original roles as palace servants. Because they had direct access to the emperor's private quarters, eunuchs became intermediaries between the ruler and the outer court. Over time, emperors relied on them for information, protection, and execution of orders. Especially when distrust of officials grew, eunuchs used this access to build networks of patronage, selling offices, manipulating judicial outcomes, and enriching themselves through corruption. Their power was not formalized in law, but it was deeply embedded in daily governance. Efforts to restrain eunuch influence repeatedly failed. Scholar officials, trained in Confucian ideals of moral governance, viewed eunuch dominance as a fundamental violation of political order. Several times, they attempted to remove or limit eunuch power through impeachment or reform campaigns. These attempts ended in disaster. Eunuchs retaliated by accusing reformers of conspiracy, leading to arrests, executions, and mass bans on political participation. The resulting purges decimated the moral and intellectual leadership of the state, leaving fewer voices capable of articulating reform. Beyond the capital, the consequences of court corruption became increasingly visible. Local officials were often appointed based on bribery rather than competence, weakening enforcement of laws and tax collection. Large landowners expanded their estates by absorbing small farms, turning free peasants into tenants or dependents. As land concentration increased, the tax base shrank, forcing the government to extract more from those least able to pay. Rural communities experienced growing poverty, insecurity, and resentment, while officials lacked the authority or will to intervene. Natural disasters compounded these problems. Floods, droughts, and locust infestations struck repeatedly, damaging crops and triggering localized famines. In Confucian political culture, such calamities were interpreted as signs of moral failure at the top. Each disaster intensified the perception that the ruling house had lost heaven's favor. While the court issued relief edicts and ritual apologies, practical assistance was often delayed or siphoned off through corruption. For many peasants, survival depended on abandoning their homes or turning to banditry. Military policy further accelerated decentralization. In response to unrest and border pressures, the court increasingly allowed local authorities to raise and command their own troops. This approach offered short-term security but weakened central control. Regional commanders gained independent power bases, loyal more to personal networks than to the dynasty. Over time, military authority became fragmented, making coordinated defense and internal order more difficult to maintain. By the later years of Eastern Han, the empire existed in a state of visible contradiction. The imperial court continued to perform rituals, issue edicts, and uphold tradition. Yet its capacity to govern effectively had eroded. Officials feared eunuch retaliation more than imperial law. Peasants viewed taxation as exploitation rather than obligation, and soldiers followed commanders rather than institutions. The machinery of empire still functioned, but its moral and administrative coherence was breaking down. These conditions created a volatile social environment. Popular religious movements gained followers by promising healing, protection, and cosmic renewal. Discontented populations sought meaning and hope outside official structures that had failed them. While open rebellion had not yet engulfed the empire, the foundations were in place. Economic inequality, political corruption, military fragmentation, and spiritual unrest converged into a combustible mixture. The Eastern Han stood outwardly unified, but inwardly fractured, approaching a moment when accumulated tensions would erupt beyond the control of the court. The accumulated pressures of the Eastern Han finally erupted in the year 184 of the Common Era, when a massive popular uprising known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion swept across the empire. Led by Zhang Jue and his followers, the movement blended social despair with religious belief, promising healing, salvation, and the coming of a new age. For millions of peasants burdened by taxes, land loss, corruption, and repeated natural disasters, these promises offered hope where the state had failed. The rebellion was not confined to a single region, but broke out simultaneously across multiple provinces, revealing the depth and breadth of social collapse. The Han court reacted with alarm. Lacking a strong, centralized army capable of suppressing unrest on such a scale, the government made a fateful decision. Local officials and regional elites were authorized to raise their own forces to combat the rebels. This policy succeeded in crushing the Yellow Turbans militarily, but it carried consequences far more destructive than the rebellion itself. By granting independent military authority to local commanders, the court effectively surrendered its monopoly on violence. Armies loyal to individuals rather than institutions became permanent fixtures of political life. Although the Yellow Turban forces were eventually defeated, the empire did not return to stability. Rebel remnants continued to operate, and famine and displacement persisted. More importantly, the newly empowered generals did not disband their troops. Instead, they consolidated territory, recruited followers, and accumulated wealth. Figures who would later dominate the historical narrative first emerged during this period, transforming from local defenders into autonomous warlords. The central government lacked both the legitimacy and the strength to reassert control over them. Inside the capital, court politics descended into chaos. Eunuchs and officials competed openly, manipulating young emperors and issuing contradictory orders. Assassinations, purges, and retaliations became common. In one dramatic episode, attempts to eliminate eunuch influence resulted instead in the massacre of officials and the destruction of what remained of moral authority at court. The imperial institution, once the unifying symbol of the realm, now appeared weak, divided, and dangerous even to those who served it. By the early 3rd century of the Common Era, the Han Emperor existed largely as a pawn. Real power lay with competing military leaders who controlled regions, resources, and populations. Although the dynasty formally continued, its authority was nominal. Laws were enforced selectively, taxes were collected inconsistently, and loyalty shifted according to immediate survival rather than imperial command. The idea of a unified empire persisted in ritual and memory, but practical governance had fragmented beyond repair. In the year 220 of the Common Era, the final Han Emperor abdicated the throne, bringing an official end to a dynasty that had ruled, with interruption, for more than 4 centuries. The collapse did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as the inevitable result of long-term decay. What followed was the era of division known as the Three Kingdoms, a period shaped by the structures, conflicts, and failures inherited from the late Han. The 400-year history of the Han Dynasty left a legacy unmatched in Chinese civilization. It established models of governance, culture, and identity that endured long after the dynasty itself vanished. At the same time, its fall offered enduring lessons about power, inequality, corruption, and the dangers of decentralization. The Han did not collapse because of one rebellion, one reform, or one ruler, but because unresolved contradictions accumulated until the system could no longer sustain them. From unification to fragmentation, the Han story stands as a reminder that stability is not permanent and that empires are shaped as much by their internal choices as by external threats. Thank you for taking this journey through 4 centuries of Han history. What do you think about the rise and fall of the Han Dynasty, and which factors do you believe mattered most in its collapse? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below.